When it comes to the mortal men in Tolkien's writings, it's hard to think of a character more iconic than Aragorn, the son of a great chief, who was adopted as a child and raised by a mighty elven lord who loved him as a father. A guy who was bestowed many different names in his life, who was loved by an elf maiden of royal descent, and ultimately embraced his fate to become one of the greatest heroes in Middle-earth's history. And then there is Túrin, the main character of this story, who I would describe as kind of an anti-Aragorn. Although that's not to say that they are polar opposites. In some ways, they're almost exactly the same. For Túrin is also the son of a great chief. He was also adopted and raised by a mighty elven lord who loved him as a father. He was also bestowed many different names in his lifetime. He was also loved by an elf maiden of royal descent, but ultimately he fought to refute his fate, and thus became one of the greatest tragedies in Middle-earth's history. So, how did it happen? How can two characters born out of such similar circumstances result in such wildly different outcomes? Well, in this video, we are going to take a look at our hero Túrin's first steps upon the road towards his doom. Maya Govanen Melanin, and welcome to another installment in this series explaining and breaking down Tolkien's epic First Age tale of the Children of Húrin. In the last video, we saw our 8-year-old protagonist, Túrin, son of Húrin, secretly depart from his ancestral home of Dor Lómin after it fell under the dominion of Morgoth and the brutal rule of his Easterlings. Túrin left his mother and his friends and everyone he knew and loved behind him, and he set off on a desperate journey into dangerous lands in search of the guarded elvish kingdom of Doriath. And so, I'll begin this video where that one left off, with a child wandering in the wild with only 2 companions to guide him. I'm going to be honest, these 2 companions are not particularly important characters. Their names are Gethron and Grithnir. That's almost all of what you need to know about them, but due to their courage and their skill and their experience in navigating perilous paths, they passed over the shadowy mountains, through the forest of Brethiel, and came at last, weary and haggard, to the borders of Doriath. And, as you certainly know by now, Doriath is a guarded kingdom. It is protected by a magical barrier created by the kinda demigod queen of Doriath, Melian the Maya. This magically defensive girdle of Melian is a hugely important part of why Doriath is still going strong despite Morgoth's overwhelming victory in the most recent battle. But interestingly, in all of Tolkien's writings, we are only ever given one description of what exactly it is this girdle does to those who trespass beyond it. And just so happens that description is found right here, in this part of the tale of the Children of Húrin. So, Túrin and his guides are already in a pretty bad way before they even arrive at the border. Dor Lómin to Doriath is not an easy journey for anyone in these dark days of Morgoth's dominion, let alone for a child. But as soon as Túrin passes the girdle of Melian, he and his guides immediately became bewildered and were enmeshed in the mazes of the Queen. They wandered lost amid the pathless trees until their food was spent, and there they came near to death. There they would have died, if not for one of the most important and unbelievably wonderful elves in this entire story. Let me take a short tangent to introduce Beleg Cuthalion, a dude who is as epic as he is, in my mind, underrated. So, Beleg Cuthalion is a Sindar elf. He is the greatest woodsman of those days, and he is one of the 2 great captains of Doriath. His official job title is Chief of the March Wardens of King Eleuthingol, and he is accounted one of the greatest archers ever to live in Middle-earth. In fact, what his name literally means is mighty strong bow. And although I've been waiting until this story to properly introduce him, we have briefly seen Beleg a couple of times before. Along with the other great captain of Doriath, Mablung of the Heavy Hand, who I'll talk about just a little later in this video, Beleg was the only elf of Doriath to join the Noldor and to fight in the Nir Naiath Arnoediad. And before that, Beleg also made a brief appearance towards the end of the tale of Beren and Luthien. He, along with that Mablung guy, was among the 5 hunters who took part in the reclaiming of the Silmaril and the slaying of Karkaroth, the mightiest werewolf ever to live. There are a few more fun facts about Beleg. He wields a great black bow called Belthronding, and he has an arrow that he calls Dailir, the Cleaver, which we are told does not suffer damage and can always be refound after Beleg has loosed it. And in addition to being one of the greatest archers of his day, Beleg is also a master of healing. Anyway, the first thing to say about Beleg in this story is that he is the one who finds Túrin and his companions as they lie in despair and suffer the effects of the Girdle of Melian. And I think it's very telling that the first thing Beleg does when he encounters these 3 trespassers in his King's Wood, one of whom is a child, is that he immediately gives them food and drink, and is filled with wonder and pity. Beleg has many awesome character traits, but right at the top of that list, this guy is wonderfully kind. And he immediately takes a particular interest in Túrin. He asks the boy what brings him into the realm of King Thingol, and 8-year-old Túrin replies, "I would be one of his knights, to ride against Morgoth and to avenge my father." To which Beleg basically says, "Nice one, kid, good answer." That's not quite word for word what Tolkien wrote, but the name of Húrin was held in honour in all the lands of the elves, and after only a few short words with the Wanderers, Beleg Cuthalion decides that he will be their guide, and he will lead them by secret ways into the hidden kingdom and towards the capital city of Menegroth, where King Thingol resides with his queen, Melian the Maya. Thus, Túrin became only the 2nd mortal ever, Beren being the first, to pass through the gates of Thingol's halls and to look upon the underground marvels of Menegroth. And in so doing, Túrin came into the care of the Elven King. Now, the last time that we saw High King Eleuthingol of the Sindar was way back in the tale of Beren and Luthien, and in that story, he did not come across as the most sympathetic of characters. His first instincts were to have Beren straight up killed for the crime of being in love with his daughter, and he had his daughter imprisoned for the crime of returning Beren's affections. I guess the fact that she is a 3,000-year-old being with immense magical powers that Thingol himself could never hope to wield is apparently just not part of his thought process. And it wasn't just Beren that Thingol was slightly, incredibly unpleasant towards. Back when the race of men first entered Beleriand and were looking for places to make a home, Thingol said, "Into Doriath shall no man come while my realm lasts." But the reason I bring this up is to highlight the extent to which Thingol has changed since then. He may not be the most unambiguously delightful elf ever to live, but I've said before that on the whole I would defend him, and it's his role in this story that makes me feel that way. Before Thingol got to know his future son-in-law, Beren, he was of the opinion that the race of men were simply beneath him. Then he actually met one of these mortals, found out that his daughter was in love with him, and thus made the questionable choice to send him on a suicide mission and get rid of him for good. Turns out, though, that this mortal Beren guy not only survived his own suicide mission, but he was also totally successful in stealing a Silmaril from the crown of Morgoth himself. He then brought that Silmaril back to Thingol in a bit of a roundabout way, died to save him from the world's mightiest werewolf, and then subsequently came back from the dead because even Ilúvatar himself recognized that this guy was an exceptional individual. And it would appear that after this, Thingol did a complete 180 on his whole "men are beneath me" stance. Because when little Túrin, son of Húrin, Beren's first cousin twice removed, by the way, was brought before Thingol and Melian, the Grey King received him kindly and set Túrin upon his knee in honour of Beren, his kinsman. And those that saw this marvelled, for it was a sign that Thingol took Túrin as his foster son. Thingol said to him, "Here, son of Húrin, shall your home be, and in all your life you shall be held as my son, man though you be. Wisdom shall be given you, and the weapons of the elves shall be set in your hands. Perhaps the time may come when you shall regain the lands of your father, but dwell now here in love." If I were Beren, I don't know how I'd feel about this insane change of heart that Thingol's undergone in the 9 years since he tried to have Beren killed. Like, where was this love when I came to Menegroth? But assuming Beren doesn't hold grudges, this is an incredibly lovely moment. The kindness that this famously grumpy elf shows to a vulnerable yet valiant child of men is a wonderfully endearing part of Thingol's character, and it's a very cool legacy of Beren and Lúthien's. I kind of imagine Thingol as being like one of those dads who says, "No, we are not getting a dog. I do not want a dog. I do not like dogs." But then, when his family gets a dog anyway, he suddenly turns into the greatest dog lover of them all. That's kinda how Thingol is with the race of men. Anyway, after taking Túrin into his loving care, Thingol sends messengers back to Morwen, Túrin's mother, in Dor-lómin. And these messengers tell her that Túrin is safe, he is a foster son of the king, and she should come to Doriath too, so that the whole family can live happily together among the elves. But when Morwen receives these messages, she doesn't do what you might expect her to do. Instead, she chooses to stay in the enemy-occupied lands of Dor-lómin. And we're told that she did this because her pride was still high. She dismissed the elven messengers and sent them back to Doriath with the very last pieces of gold and precious objects that she had left. These were intended as payment for Thingol's fostering of Túrin, but it was also a means of Morwen hiding her poverty. And this is interesting because later in the video we are going to see Túrin's pride and his dire reluctance to accept the mercy of others. This pride is going to get him into trouble, but it's definitely worth noting that this character trait is not unique to Túrin. It is very much inherited from his mother. And right here we see Morwen make a pretty self-destructive decision that it's hard to see as much more than an abject rejection of humility. However, before I over-criticize Morwen, it is definitely worth pointing out that at this moment in time, she is also nursing a newborn baby, Túrin's younger sister, the other child of Húrin's. This baby girl is given the name Nienor, and what Nienor means in Sindarin is morning. Not morning, as in the opposite of evening, but morning, as in an opposite of laughter. Túrin has two sisters, one of whom was known as Lalaith, which means laughter, and the other one is Nienor, morning. And I think these name choices speak volumes regarding Morwen's perception of what kind of life these daughters are going to go on to live. Any hope and optimism that she had for her first daughter is totally absent for her second. From the very moment she is born, Morwen believes that Nienor's life will be defined by sorrow. Now, I will definitely return to Morwen and Nienor later in the story, but it won't be for a little while. Throughout the rest of Túrin's childhood and early adulthood, his mother and sister will be living in Dor Lómin, resisting the tyranny of the Easterlings. However, there is one last treasure that Morwen sends to Doriath with Eleuthingol's messengers, and that is a super iconic helmet called the Dragon Helm of Dor Lómin. This helm has become an heirloom of the House of Hador, but it was actually gifted to Hador himself by High King Fingon of the Noldor. And yet this is not an elvish helmet. It was in turn gifted to Fingon by his beloved cousin Maedhros, and Maedhros acquired it after saving the life of the great dwarven king Azagal of Belegost. This is a dwarf forged helmet. It was made by the arguably greatest dwarven craftsman ever to live, Telkar of Nogrod, same guy who forged Narsil, by the way, the blade that will one day cut the ring from Sauron's hand, and there was a power in the helm that guarded any who wore it from wound or death, for the sword that hewed it was broken, and the dart that smote it sprang aside. This helmet struck fear into all those who beheld it. It had a visor that protected the wearer from dragonfire, and on its crest was set in defiance a gilded image of Glaurung the dragon. Which is interesting because Glaurung the dragon is going to be a very important part of this story a little later down the line, but even at this very early stage, Túrin, the dragon of Dor Lómin, is being set against Glaurung, the golden worm of Angband. Even before they meet, they are already very much on each other's radar. Anyway, poor Túrin is pretty devastated when he learns that his mother and sister will not be joining him in Doriath, and although he is now the foster son of the High King, a shadow lay on his youth. But Eleuthingol is not the only royal in Doriath to demonstrate great love for Túrin. Though he saw her seldom, Queen Melian the Maya also took a particular interest in the boy, but she did so from afar. Within the forest surrounding Menegroth there lived an elf maiden called Nellas, and Melian sent Nellas to watch over Túrin whenever he strayed into the woods, and to eventually befriend him. Within time they played together, or walked hand in hand, for he grew swiftly, whereas she seemed no more than a maiden of his own age. Nellas taught Túrin many secrets of the wood, and she also taught him how to speak in a much more ancient dialect of Sindarin, which was more courteous and richer in beautiful words than the Sindarin dialect used by the Noldor and their mannish friends. And although this isn't the biggest deal in the story, I think it's fascinating that Túrin alone, of all mortals in Beleriand, is able to speak this particularly ancient and particularly beautiful regional tongue of an elvish language, a language that was spoken in these woods before even Morgoth or the Noldor returned to Middle-earth. However, despite how awesome it may sound being childhood friends with an elf maiden, Túrin's relationship with Nellas did not last. As Túrin's boyhood passed and he turned his thoughts to the deeds of men, he saw her less and less often, and at last called for her no more. But she watched over him still, though now she remained hidden. For 9 years, Túrin dwelt in the underground halls of Menegroth, and in that time he grew strong and he grew tall, until he surpassed the height of most elves. He became renowned within Doriath for his strength and his hardihood, and under the instruction of his foster father, King Eleuthingol, he learned much lore, hearing eagerly the histories of ancient days and great deeds of old, and he became thoughtful and sparing of speech. By the time he turned 17, Túrin was held in love and esteem by those who knew him well, and he had honour within the realm of Thingol. But of all the Sindar who loved Túrin, there is one in particular who stands head and shoulders above the rest in terms of just how heartwarming his love is. And that elf is, of course, the March Warden himself, Beleg Cuthalion. During Túrin's adolescence, he developed a wonderful friendship with Beleg, and often Beleg came to Menegroth to seek him out and to lead him far afield into the forests, where he taught Túrin woodcraft and archery, and the thing that Túrin loved most of all, the handling of swords. Interestingly though, despite Túrin's natural talent as a swordsman, he was not particularly gifted as a craftsman, for he was slow to learn his own strength, and often what he designed went awry. By the way, that sentence sums up a good deal of Túrin's future. Nevertheless, under Beleg's tutelage, Túrin became one of the mightiest warriors in the woodland realm, and in the year that he turned 17, he began to turn his attention away from the lore and learning of Menegroth, and instead he looked towards the battles on Doriath's borders, with the ever-multiplying masses of Morgoth's minions. Within the decade that followed the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, Morgoth's power grew and grew and grew until orcs swarmed all across the north, and eventually they passed downriver into central Beleriand and towards the northern borders of Doriath. As a result, all contact between Doriath and Dor-lómin came to a halt, and Túrin's heart grew heavy with foreboding that an ill fate would befall his mother and sister. So he went to his foster parents Thingol and Melian, and when Thingol looked in wonder upon his adopted son, what he saw was a man and a stranger, tall, dark-haired, looking at him with deep eyes stern and proud. When Thingol asks Túrin what he desires from him, Túrin replies, "Mail, sword, and a shield of my stature, lord. Also by your leave I will now reclaim the dragon helm of my sires." Thingol gives to Túrin exactly what he desires. He appoints him a knight of Doriath, but he also gives his son some wise counsel. He says, "A man you seem in stature, and indeed more than many already, but none the less you have not come to the fullness of your manhood that shall be. Until that is achieved, you should be patient, testing and training your strength." He goes on to say, one man alone cannot best the Dark Lord himself, to which Túrin replies basically, "Isn't that exactly what Beren did?" But then it is time for Melian to speak. "Beren and Luthien," she says, "but not so high as your destiny, I think, Túrin, son of Morwen. Though greatness is in you, and your fate is twined with that of the elven folk, for good or for ill, beware of yourself. Fear both the heat and cold of your heart, and strive for patience if you can." Throughout the many tales of the First Age, Melian gives so much fantastic advice, and yet she is ignored so often, it's crazy. Especially considering, you know, she is an offspring of Ilúvatar's thought. Anyway, Túrin hears these words and he does bow before his foster parents, but I can't say he quite embodies the patience that both Thingol and Melian are counseling here. Instead, he takes up the dragon helm of his ancestors, he arms himself with elven blades and elven mail, and he journeys northwest, beyond the marches of Doriath to an area called Dimbar, which is outside of the girdle of Melian and has now become overrun with the enemy. There, Túrin joins the elven warriors of Doriath as they wage unceasing war upon the orcs and all other servants and creatures of Morgoths who strayed too close to the guarded realm. Thus, while yet scarcely out of his boyhood, his strength and courage were proved, and he was ever forward in deeds of daring. In these battles with the servants of Morgoth, Túrin received many wounds from arrows and spears and orc swords, but his doom delivered him from death. And among the servants of the enemy, fearful rumours began to spread of the dreaded dragon helm of Dorlomin. His true identity remained unknown, but his reputation went far and wide, and people even began to wonder if he was perhaps the hero Húrin himself, escaped from the pits of hell. In fact, of all the Sindar warriors fighting to the north of Doriath, one only was mightier in arms than Túrin, and that was Beleg Strongbow. This is the first time in the story that we get to see just how epic Túrin can be when he is unleashed upon the enemy. He's only 17 years old, yet alongside his beloved buddy Beleg Cuthalion, the mysterious dragon helm of Dorlomin is one half of arguably the most badass friendship anywhere in Tolkien's entire legendarium. And so, this seems like an appropriate place for a little bit of a tangent to properly discuss that idea I mentioned right back at the beginning of this video. Túrin can be thought of, to an extent, as a sort of anti-Aragorn, or perhaps the opposite side of that same coin. The similarities are striking, and they go pretty deep. When Aragorn was 2 years old, his father was killed by a poisoned orc arrow through the eye, which interestingly is also exactly how Túrin's uncle, Húrin, was killed in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. And so, 2-year-old Aragorn was sent away by his mother to go live under the protection of Lord Elrond in Rivendell. There he was fostered in secret by Lord Elrond and loved by him like a father loves a son. He was trained in archery and woodcraft and swordsmanship by his dear elvish friends, the rangers Elladan and Elrohir, and when he came of age, Elrond gave him the broken blade Narsil, an heirloom of his ancestors, which, either by coincidence or by Tolkien's design, was originally forged by the exact same dwarf who forged the dragon helm of Túrin's ancestors that Thingol gave to him when he came of age. Both Aragorn and Túrin spent their childhoods hidden from the Dark Lord by their elven foster fathers. They both await their inheritance, and they both have a fate that they must eventually step into. And over the course of their lives, they are both known by many, many, many different names. As a child, Aragorn was known as Estel, which means hope, and he was given this name to hide his identity from the servants of Sauron. When he was grown and he entered the wild to begin his days as a ranger, he was given the name Strider, a humble title, but one that again served the positive purpose of keeping Aragorn secret until he was ready to step into his fate. Then Aragorn travelled into the south, where he once again kept his identity secret, and he was once again given the name Thorongil. There are, of course, a few other names that Aragorn is given throughout his life, but the most iconic one of all is Elessar. And Elessar is the name he is given by Galadriel, and then later, and totally independently, by the people of Minas Tirith, when the time eventually comes for him to step into his fate and become the king. Túrin's different names, on the other hand, are much less to do with embracing fate, and much more to do with trying to escape it. A good few of Túrin's names are given by other people, but the most iconic ones are chosen by Túrin himself, as a way of, I guess, distancing himself from the man he was before he took that name. Aragorn is given his names as a way of preserving who he is truly meant to be, but Túrin takes his names as a way of kind of rejecting who he is truly meant to be. And one other big way in which Aragorn and Túrin are very, very similar, yet simultaneously very, very different, is the way that they are both loved by a mighty elven maiden. Arwen and Aragorn are the final point on the triangle of elf-man marriages that, changed the world. The other two being Luthien and Beren, and Idril and a guy called Tuor, who just so happens to be Túrin's cousin. And yet, there will come a point in this story where Túrin himself will meet an elvish princess, and she will fall in love with him. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but unlike Aragorn and his kinsman Beren and his cousin Tuor, Túrin does not love the princess back. He will have an opportunity to marry Galadriel's niece, to make that elf-man triangle into a square, but he doesn't. And, as we'll soon see, that decision has dire consequences for everyone involved. In fact, it could be argued, just as the love that Arwen gives to Aragorn is what seals his fate in a positive way and makes him the man he's meant to be, Túrin's rejection of that elvish princess is the most crucial thing that seals his fate and makes him into a man that he should never have become. Anyway, that's just something to hold in your mind as these videos move forward, but getting back to our immediate story, Túrin spends 3 more years being a badass with his buddy Beleg, and in that time he hardly ever leaves the front lines of the fight. Until, eventually, at the age of 20 years old, Túrin finally does return to Menegroth for a little bit of rest and relaxation, and to get his weapons and armor repaired before going back to Dimbar to continue killing the servants of Morgoth. And as you can probably imagine, Túrin now looks quite a bit different from how he looked when he first left Thingol and Melian. His hair was unkempt, and his mail covered with a grey cloak stained with the weather. When he returned to Menegroth, he came unlooked for into the King's Hall, but as it chanced, both Thingol and Melian were away from their capital city at this time to walk the green woods together in high summer. And so, Túrin took a seat beside that other awesome captain of Doriath, Marblung the Hunter, a most excellent elf who, much like Beleg, is also a dear friend to Túrin. But there is one more elf in Menegroth that I really need to introduce here, and his name is Saeros. Actually, fun fact, if Tolkien had lived longer, Saeros might instead have been called Orgol. That is the name that Tolkien seemed to have settled on, but he never made it official, and so Saeros is the name that Christopher Tolkien stuck with. Anyway, Saeros is one of the Lyaquendi, one of the Green Elves, so he's a Sylvan Wood Elf. He's not one of the Sindar, but he is a member of the court of King Thingol, so he's quite a big deal in Menegroth. However, I think the most technical term for what Saeros is would be a dick. Seriously, Saeros sucks. He's not quite evil, although, actually, I'll let you decide whether or not he's evil in just a few minutes' time, but regardless, he is a mean-spirited, overly haughty racist who is absolutely awful to be around. And it probably won't surprise you to learn that this elven scumbag really doesn't like Túrin. Anyway, as I say, after 3 years in the wild, Túrin has come back to Menegroth, and after entering the King's Hall and finding his foster parents not present, he decides to sit beside the respected hunter Marblung of the Heavy Hand. Unfortunately, however, the seat that Túrin sits in just so happens to belong to this Saeros guy. And unlike all the reasonable elves in this story, when Saeros finds Túrin sitting in his chair, his reaction is halfway between like a spoiled 5-year-old and an entitled customer who believes the entire world revolves around them. He enters the hall late, sees Túrin sitting where he wants to sit, he immediately gets upset that no one kept his chair free for him, and then he jumps to the conclusion that Túrin obviously did this on purpose as an act of spite and with the intent to insult him. None of this is true, obviously, but Saeros is the kind of elf who would, I think, obnoxiously demand to speak with Túrin's manager if such things existed in Doriath. Anyway, for a while, Saeros sits in another seat and just stares at Túrin while he's trying to have a nice conversation with Marblung, but then Saeros pipes up and out of absolutely nowhere, he interrupts the conversation and just starts insulting Túrin. And though his words seemed fair, the mockery in his voice could not be mistaken. Túrin finds these insults wearisome. He thinks about Beleg and how much he'd rather be killing orcs than dealing with this clown, but he takes the high road and he simply frowns at the douchey elf without giving a reply. And so Saeros says he's sorry, and he stops bothering Túrin and he departs the story forever. Just kidding. No, he doesn't do that. What he does instead is double down and become even more of an ass. He starts insulting Túrin's appearance, and then he takes things in a weirdly and specifically mean-spirited direction. Saeros holds up a golden comb, and he throws it at Túrin, crying, "Doubtless, man of Dorlomin, you came in haste to this table and may be excused your ragged cloak, but there is no need to leave your head untended as a thicket of brambles, and maybe if your ears were uncovered, you would heed better what is said to you." Once again, Túrin says nothing in response, but he turns his eyes upon Saeros, and there was a glint in their darkness. But Saeros did not heed the warning. Instead, he sprinkled a pinch of sexism into his personal attack, and he says to Túrin, "If the men of Dorlomin are so wild and fell, of what sort are the women of that land? Do they run like the deer, clad only in their hair?" Finally, after this, Túrin does give an answer. He picked up his cup and he hurled it into Saeros's face. Saeros fell back bleeding from a broken mouth, and Túrin drew his sword. There he would have slain Saeros if not for the intervention of Mablung, who restrained him. And I think it's interesting to note here that when Saeros mocked Túrin, Túrin did nothing. When Saeros disparaged his hair and his clothes, Túrin did nothing. But when Saeros insulted the women of Dorlomin, Morwen, Nienor, that Lady Irene, and all the others, that's when Túrin put a stop to it. Fair enough, throwing a cup at a dude's face and then drawing your weapon in the King's Hall might not be the most heroic deed in all of Middle-earth's history. It is hard to imagine that Aragorn would have done that, but A, Saeros totally deserves it, B, Túrin is only 20 years old at this point, and C, although the act itself may not be the most honourable thing, the motive was, in my mind, pretty justified. Túrin didn't attack Saeros because he was insulted. He didn't attack him out of personal pride. He attacked him to defend the honour of those who were not present to defend themselves. Throughout his entire life, Túrin has an incredibly strong sense of justice, which does, on occasion, get him into trouble, but it's a very consistent, and I would argue pretty admirable trait to have. It's true, he may take it too far sometimes, but almost always Túrin's acts of violence against non-servants of the enemy are done within the context of either defending the innocent or punishing those that he deems unjust. It's not wrath that guides his hand or hatred, it is a strong sense of justice. Anyway, Mablung restrains Túrin and prevents him from killing Saeros then and there, but then Saeros spits blood, and he says, "How long shall we harbour this wood woes?" When Túrin sees the blood upon the table, his mood cools, and he departs the King's Hall without another word. But Mablung does not go with him. Instead, Mablung does what I imagine all of us would want to do in this situation. He tells Saeros just how much of a dick he is being. Mablung says, "For this evil I hold you to blame, and maybe the king's law will judge a broken mouth a just return for your taunting." But Saeros replies, "If the cub has a grievance, let him bring it to the king. But the drawing of swords here is not to be excused for any such cause. Outside the hall, if the wood woes draws on me, I shall kill him." To which Mablung answers, "It might well go otherwise. But if either of you be slain, it will be an evil deed, more fit for Angband than Doriath. Take heed, Saeros, lest you do the will of Morgoth in your pride." Unfortunately though, Mablung's words of wisdom do not seem to get through to Saeros, and that night his wrath and his malice grew as he nursed his injured mouth. The next morning, Túrin decided that he'd had enough of Menegroth and that he would return to wonderful Beleg upon the fields of battle in Dimbar. So Túrin sets off early into the woods, but he did not get far before realizing that Saeros was following him in secret. And he wasn't following because he wanted to chat. Saeros was armed with a sword and a shield. He ran at Túrin, intending to stab him in the back, to murder him in the most premeditated way possible, but he failed. Under the guidance of Beleg Cuthalion, Túrin has been training in the wilds for years, and had grown as agile as any elf, but stronger. After a sudden duel of swift blades, Túrin clove Saeros' shield, he wounded his enemy's sword arm, disarmed him, and held the elf at his mercy. But Túrin did not kill him. Instead, he remembered that strange combination of words that Saeros had used to describe the women of Dorlomin. Running, naked like a deer, clad only in their hair. And so, that's what Túrin does to Saeros. He strips this mocker of women naked, and then tells him to run. And unless you go swift as the deer, I shall prick you on from behind. So Saeros sprints naked through the wood, crying out in terror, while Túrin chases after him like a hound, swiping at him with his sword. Eventually, the clamour of the chase is heard by many elves in Doriath, and among them is Mablung, who runs after Túrin to try and put a stop to this orc work, as he calls it. But Túrin calls back to Mablung, this is only orc play, and he continues chasing Saeros. Although we are actually told that if Mablung hadn't said this, Túrin was at this point ready to give up the hunt and let Saeros go. However, in his terror of Túrin, Saeros made a wild leap over a deep ravine to try and escape him. But his footing failed, and instead he plummeted down to his death, his body broken on the rocks below. And thus Saeros ended his life in Doriath, and long would Mandos hold him. When Mablung catches up to him, Túrin looks down at the broken body on the rocks, and he says, "Unhappy fool. From here I would have let him walk back to Menegroth. Now he has laid a guilt upon me, undeserved." Which puts Mablung in a bit of a tricky situation. On the one hand, Saeros was a dick, but on the other hand, he is dead now, and it's very much worth pointing out that Mablung does not know that Saeros attacked Túrin first and meant to murder him. All he's aware of is what Túrin did after that. So, after a long silence, Mablung says with pity, "Alas, come back now with us, Túrin, for the king must judge these deeds." But I think it can be argued that Túrin's response to Mablung in this moment is, in hindsight, one of the worst decisions that he ever makes in his entire life. Túrin says, if the king were just, he would judge me guiltless. But was not this one of his counsellors? Why should a just king choose a heart of malice for his friend? I abjure his law and his judgment. To which Mablung replies, "Your words are too proud. Learn wisdom. I bid you return with me as a friend. When the king learns the truth, you may hope for his pardon." But Túrin says, "I refuse your bidding. I will not seek his pardon for nothing. I will go now, where his doom cannot find me." If Túrin had just gone back with Mablung, if he'd swallowed his pride and faced the judgment of his beloved foster father, or at least just told Mablung the truth that Syros was the guy who started it, so much hardship and pain would have been avoided. But before we all judge Túrin for being an absolute idiot, I do want to remind everyone that A, he did not intend to kill Syros, B, Syros did intend to kill him, and C, Túrin is the son of a mother who is also a good person, but is also afflicted with this overbearing pride that makes it very difficult for her to accept the mercy of anyone else. In this regard, Túrin absolutely is his mother's son. And what Túrin fears most in his life is not death or pain, it is captivity. And so he leaves Mablung with only two choices. Either let him go or slay him. Mablung tells Túrin that one death is enough, and Túrin tells him, "I did not will it, but I do not mourn it. May Mandos judge him justly, and if ever he return to the land of the living, may he prove wiser. Farewell." "Fare free," Mablung replies, "for that is your wish. To say well would be vain if you go this way. A shadow is over you. When we meet again, may it be no darker." But to that, Túrin made no answer. Instead, he left Mablung. He left all the elves, he left Doriath, and for the second time in his life, Túrin wandered off into the wild. Only this time he is utterly alone. And no one among the Sindar has any idea where he's gone or how to find him again. Now, it wasn't long after Túrin's departure that Thingol and Melian returned to Menegroth, and they learned that their foster son had vanished into some self-imposed banishment. And also, at around the same time, Túrin's best buddy Beleg also came to Menegroth to discover why his friend had not returned to fight alongside him in Dimbar. And so, despite Túrin's absence, he is put on trial anyway, and King Thingol orders that all witnesses come forward to explain to him what happened so that he may pass judgment on his wayward son. Obviously, Mablung is the guy who knows the most, and he offers a very fair assessment of what happened. He loves Túrin, but he loves truth more, and when Thingol hears all that Mablung has to say, he deems that Syros was indeed a dick, and would face punishment for what he said in the hall if he was still alive, but that does not excuse Túrin's waylaying of him in the woods. According to Thingol, what Syros did was bad, but what Túrin did was worse. So Thingol decrees, "I will banish Túrin until he sues for pardon at my feet. If any here accounts this unjust, let him speak now." And at the very last moment, someone does indeed speak up. Beleg Cuthalion. He comes late to the king's court, but he brings with him a surprise witness. Remember that Lady Nellas, the maiden whom Melian the Maya instructed to watch over Túrin all those years ago? Well, she has been watching him. She was out there, sitting unseen in a tree, when she witnessed Saeros attack Túrin. And she tells the king and all his court that Túrin is valiant but merciful. Saeros was the one who did great evil in trying to murder Túrin, but once Túrin had bested him and disarmed him, he chose not to slay him. He could have, but he didn't. He is not a villain. And he did not will Saeros's death in the end. With this bombshell dropped, Thingol immediately changes his judgment. He decrees that such fault as can be found in Túrin I now pardon, holding him wronged and provoked. And since it was, as he said, one of my council who misused him, he shall not seek for this pardon, but I will send it to him, wherever he may be found, and I will recall him in honor to my halls. And so, just like that, Túrin is forgiven. It is announced that he shall be welcomed back to Doriath as if nothing ever happened. Except there is still one problem. No one knows where Túrin went. So how can they tell him that he need be an outlaw no longer? Well, the answer to that question is, once again, Beleg Cuthalion. The day after Thingol passed his judgment, Beleg came before him, and he said to the king, "Give me leave, lord, and on your behalf I will redress this evil if I can. For such manhood as he promised should not run to nothing in the wild, and I love him." To which Thingol replies, "Beleg Cuthalion, long have you been foremost in the defence of Doriath, and for many deeds of valour and wisdom have earned my thanks. Greatest of all I shall hold the finding of Túrin." And so, Beleg takes his leave. He takes a black sword with him forged from the metal of a meteorite, which I will talk a lot more about in future videos, and on behalf of Thingol and Melian, he ventures away from Doriath and he enters the wilds of Beleriand, searching season after season, wandering through peril after peril in the hope of finally fulfilling his quest to find Túrin and to bring him home. And so, that is where I'll end this video. But in the next one, we will continue the tale of Túrin in the wild. We'll take a look at the outlaws and the wolf men who ravage the lawless lands of Beleriand, and we will explore what happens when good guys go bad. But until then, thank you all very much for making it to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, be sure to click like and leave a comment and hit subscribe if you haven't already to make sure you don't miss the rest of this story. However, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Navair Melanin.